A box has been opened, and Jabberwock, Bandersnatch, and a host of other things have appeared. They exist like elusive, imperceptible phantoms, skulking in and around our sense of well-being. They are chemicals, mysterious substances, with long, confusing names. Under their spell, even the red crisp apple is suspect. Their use has evolved with progress, lifestyle, permanent fresh shirts, permafresh foods, computers, bug sprays, furniture polish. Progress, like many other things, has its risks. We can't realistically obliterate all of the man-made or natural substances that threaten our sense of well-being, but we can strive to manage such threats more effectively, so they become much less a threat. Any management decision involves making choices, and we, as individuals and as a society, face some tough choices. What do we value? What must we protect? Can we have what we have and enjoy it too? Can we afford our risks? We're concerned about chemicals that have escaped into the environment or that lurk in the workplace or in our homes because of the possibility that human health and environmental safety are at risk. Living is risky enough as it is, and we generally prefer to have the option of picking and choosing which risks to take and which risks not to take. These risks of our own choice are referred to as voluntary risks. If we choose to drink, smoke, or drive a car, we are taking voluntary risks. Most of us don't think twice about riding in a car, although we know accidents can happen. We tend to assume that the odds will be in our favor. But if we want to, we can take steps to minimize our risks. In a voluntary risk situation, we feel we have some control over the outcome. An involuntary risk, such as living near a nuclear power plant or drinking contaminated water, is missing that sense of control. It is a situation which exposes us to some degree of risk, like it or not. Any risk involves the possibility of loss or injury, and in making our personal risk decisions, we routinely weigh this possibility. We make choices, consciously or unconsciously. Public policymakers must also make choices, conscious choices, to act on the possibility and the probability of risk, but on behalf of large populations. Federal and state environmental agencies must deal with those issues of involuntary risk related to harmful substances in the environment. They are responsible for taking the necessary steps to minimize these risks. But these agencies are dealing with a growing list of potential environmental hazards. Why? Well, for one thing, we are exposed to more substances that have accumulated in our water, air, and soil over the years. And in recent years, the American public has said, we do not feel we should have to be exposed to these chemicals. Thus, as we have identified our environmental concerns, we have, as a society, responded with numerous protective laws, regulations, and statutes. We've done a lot more testing for chemicals, and in addition, science has developed better and better analytical techniques for detecting smaller and smaller concentrations of these substances in our environment, which presents another kind of dilemma, because we can now detect potentially dangerous substances at extremely minute concentrations. And some of these substances may, in fact, be quite harmless below a certain threshold or level of concentration. But often, people view a potential hazard as hazardous at any concentration. environmental agencies try to differentiate between potentially risky substances so that the most important dangers can be discovered and regulated. To do this, these agencies use the processes referred to as risk assessment and risk management. This presentation is about the processes and perplexities of risk assessment and risk management in environmental protection. These regulatory approaches are an aspect of environmental protection which are controversial and sometimes confusing. But by pointing out some basic information about risk assessment and risk management, we hope to make it easier for the public to understand and participate in public policy decisions involving environmental risks. Simply stated, risk assessment is a process scientists use to estimate potential public health impacts from specific hazards. It is a way of finding out how big certain health and environmental problems are compared to other known health and environmental problems. Risk management is a process policymakers use to decide to what extent the hazard in question needs to be regulated. It's a process that takes into account the results of the risk assessment, plus the political, social, and economic impacts of any regulatory decision. Let's begin our explanation of risk assessment and risk management by inventing a potentially hazardous chemical. We'll call it tetrahydrothretinol. Let's say it's a pesticide commonly used in household bug spray, and it has been on the market for about 6 years. At present, tetrahydrothretinol is only required to have a label warning the user that it is harmful if swallowed and that it causes eye irritation. The warning gives no indication of the possibility of harmful effects over a long period of exposure. Tetrahydrothretinol joins the list of over 60,000 chemicals that are in commercial use in the United States, not to mention the 500 to 1,000 new chemicals that are added each year. Usually risk assessments are performed for chemicals which have some evidence that they may cause an adverse health effect. If you are wondering why state or federal governments do not require risk assessments for all chemicals, it is because these procedures, in most cases, take years to complete and can cost millions of dollars. So, let's say that a study examining the potential long-term toxicity of tetrahydrothretinol — toxicity, by the way, refers to the degree of danger posed by a substance to human health — let's say this study revealed increased rates of lung cancer in mice exposed to the tetrahydrothretinol. Now we have cause to be suspicious about this chemical, and now we can try to figure out how dangerous it is to humans by doing a risk assessment. A risk assessment for a particular chemical involves 4 basic steps. In the first step, referred to as hazard identification, scientists weigh all available evidence to see if the chemical may cause adverse health effects in people or animals. Can they associate the chemical with a particular effect? Does the chemical cause cancer, birth defects, reproductive defects, or genetic damage? Then, in the second step, the dose-response assessment, scientists determine what levels of the chemical cause adverse health effects. In step 3, the exposure assessment, scientists try to find out how much of the chemical is in the environment and where and how people are exposed. And finally, in step 4, the risk is characterized. By combining the results from the dose-response assessment and the exposure assessment, scientists determine the probability that the chemical will be harmful to a person. It is a way of stating the potential harm of the chemical. So, going back to step 1 of the risk assessment, scientists gather all the available information on tetrahydrothretinol and then critically evaluate that information to see if there is any toxic effect which could be the basis for some kind of regulation. As often turns out, there is very limited information on tetrahydrothretinol, but enough to suggest further investigation is needed. Now we go to the next step, the dose-response assessment, in which scientists try to determine exactly what the chemical does to living organisms at specific doses. Enter the rats and the mice, the human surrogates. Although these critters don't look a lot like you or me, generally a substance that will kill a rat or a mouse or cause cancer in a rat or mouse may also cause cancer in humans. Through animal studies, we can obtain a fairly accurate estimate of what might happen to people. To determine this dose-response relationship, scientists expose laboratory animals to various doses of a chemical, then measure the animal's response, and then extrapolate these results to apply to human beings. They look for changes in effects at different exposure levels. Are there immediate ill effects at high doses? If so, what are they? What happens when the doses are low over a long period of time? When higher doses cause increased effects, we have greater confidence in the study. In a controlled laboratory setting, scientists also take into account the effect of such variables as diet, age, or genetic composition. Relatively high doses of the chemical are necessary in this kind of animal testing to cause a statistically significant increase in the number of cancers, for example, in what is usually a small group of 50 to 100 rats. By using rats and mice under extremely controlled conditions, scientists can develop a dose-response relationship, which is a measure of the potency of the chemical. A chemical that has certain effects at low doses is more potent than another chemical which has the same effect, but at higher doses. In the case of tetrahydrothretanol, the dose-response assessment showed that the pesticide caused a significant amount of lung cancer at low doses, but only when the chemical was inhaled. In step 3, the exposure assessment, scientists want to find out how much of the tetrahydrothretanol is out there in the environment, where it is found, and how or if people are exposed to it. They want to know how much of the chemical is being produced, how much is already in use or storage, what are the maximum concentrations that people are exposed to, where does the chemical go in the environment? Does it get dumped into waterways, landfills? Is it emitted into the air? Does it accumulate in the environment? Or does it decompose into harmless or sometimes more harmful compounds? In other words, what is the active life of the chemical? For example, cadmium oxide, a byproduct of zinc smelting, will persist in the human body for 50 years, concentrating in the liver and kidneys. How many people are exposed to the chemical, and by what routes? A chemical that evaporates quickly into the air, for example, would be, from a regulatory perspective, an air pollution problem, whereas substances that end up in the soil or water tend to be soil or water problems. As we move along in this risk assessment process, more and more questions arise. Does the chemical get into our food chain? And if so, will there be higher concentrations of it as it moves up the food chain? For instance, fish living in dioxin-contaminated water have over 200,000 times more dioxin in their flesh and fat than is found in the water. The tetrahydrothretanol exposure assessment revealed that on the average, 1 can of tetrahydrothretanol was used per family per year. In reality, of course, some people use more, some use less, and some use none at all. The pesticide was also used in higher concentrations by professional exterminators, but they are probably better informed of the risks and are expected to take the proper precautions. We now have enough information about tetrahydrothretanol to develop a risk characterization, which is the last step in the risk assessment process. In this step, a mathematical model is used to estimate how many people could get lung cancer if exposed to tetrahydrothretanol at a given level, assuming humans will react to the chemical similarly to the test animals. The risk characterization for tetrahydrothretanol, based on the human exposure and the dose-response information, indicates that, on the average, a person inhaling the chemical for 10 minutes once a month would have a 1 in 100,000 increased chance of getting lung cancer. Basically, this is risk assessment. It tells how harmful the substance may be at concentrations that people are exposed to. The risk assessment often requires approximation because of incomplete data. Also, the risk assessment does not take into account the cumulative effect of this chemical when exposure is combined with other harmful chemicals found in the environment. Likewise, in the risk management decision, environmental and public health agencies recognize there are uncertainties and try to address them by making conservative assumptions on the side of public protection. In general, regulations will be designed to protect not only the healthy adult man or woman, but also the more sensitive individuals, such as children, the elderly, and people with specific health problems. Regulatory agencies feel the pressure to control harmful pollutants before any severe damage is done, before there is a human body count. If available evidence strongly suggests that a particular substance is dangerous to human health, then neither regulators nor society as a whole can afford to delay action while waiting for complete information, which could take years to accumulate. Now that the risk assessment for tetrahydrocanol is complete, and the regulatory agency has evidence that the chemical poses a significant risk when inhaled for relatively short periods of time, a risk management decision is necessary. State and federal environmental and public health regulatory agencies have the frustrating job of determining how much risk the public should accept. The result of the risk management decision is generally some kind of regulatory control. There are varying degrees of regulation depending on how bad the substance is. Let's put our discussion of tetrahydrocanol risk management aside for a moment to examine what some of these varying degrees of regulation might include. A few chemicals pose such a serious threat to human health and the environment that the only solution is to prohibit their use. DDT was banned in 1973 because it was obvious that the chemical was very dangerous. It persisted in the environment. It was found in detectable levels in people throughout the country, and it was toxic to birds and many other animals. We could see that this pesticide, a chemical we thought was the answer to all our insect worries, had caused more harm than benefit. But in most cases, the answer to what to do about a risk is not so clear. Regulating a risk by eliminating it is the exception rather than the rule. Take cigarette smoking, for example. It's deadly. It's strongly linked with coronary heart disease, which is the leading cause of death in the United States. Smoking causes an estimated 85% of lung cancer cases. It causes emphysema. Smoking by pregnant women may result in fetal injury, premature birth, and low birth weight. But we haven't banned smoking. Instead, we inform the public of the dangers of smoking, we provide no smoking areas in public places, and we ban cigarette ads on TV. In other cases, we accept a certain amount of risk for the greater public good. For instance, we know that chlorine in our water supplies can break down to chloroform, and chloroform causes cancer. However, we continue to use chlorine as a disinfectant. This is because the chances of dying from harmful germs in our water, if we did not use chlorine, would be much higher than the chances of dying from cancer from chlorine in our water. Economics also plays a part in this decision. There are other alternative but costly disinfection methods available. In time, we may develop safer, more efficient, and less expensive methods to replace chlorine. Sometimes we must manage a risk with mitigation measures. That is, taking specific actions to make the situation less severe. An example of this would be an incident involving the detection of a toxic substance in a public water supply. Say the substance is traced back to an existing solid waste disposal site. The regulatory agency has one or more risk management or regulatory options it might consider. Depending on the circumstances, it could do one or more of the following: shut down the contaminated well, require removal of the toxic constituents from the site, determine that a groundwater withdrawal and treatment system must be installed, or require the installation of water filters in the home. What if you had the job of determining the fate of tetrahydrocanol? How would you choose? Would you ban the chemical? Studies showed it is a very effective and inexpensive chemical, which would be virtually harmless if used in the right conditions. Perhaps it should be eliminated from household use, but allowed under prescribed conditions for licensed exterminators. Perhaps there is an alternative chemical that does the same job, a little more expensive, but much less harmful. Many risk management decisions are very complex. Take, for example, a proposed new source of risk, such as the construction of a new resource recovery facility. Suppose this facility, comprising a sophisticated solid waste incinerator and electrical power generator, had been proposed for a fictional New England community we'll call Pleasantville. It could provide the town with a substantially increased tax base, as well as other negotiable benefits. Pleasantville and many other surrounding communities have run out of landfill space and need a solid waste disposal alternative. The cost of having their waste hauled to a site 50 miles away would be very high. Besides, the destruction of waste by incineration seems more sensible than leaving it to rot in the ground like a ticking time bomb, waiting to leak into a water supply. But is the destruction of that waste complete? Unfortunately, emissions from the smokestacks of resource recovery facilities include some toxic constituents, and there can be some nasty solid waste ash. And there is the increased traffic created by the transport of the waste, and not all solid waste can be burned. So what do you do with the rest? Here is a situation in which a risk management decision must be made by the environmental and health agencies and the community. The state agencies decide if the increased risk is negligible, and the community must decide if the increased risk is acceptable. The risk management decision entails weighing the costs and the benefits of regulatory options. In deciding on Pleasantville's new facility, the decision makers will weigh the economic, social, and political considerations against the important goal of protecting human health. Costs associated with any risk management decision may include the cost of pollution control, the cost of substituting a more expensive chemical for the dangerous one, the cost of lost jobs or businesses, the cost of health problems, the cost of a degraded environment resulting in the loss of water supply or a playground area. Benefits may include the preservation of a quality environment, the prevention of potential health risks, the creation of new jobs and businesses to produce a chemical substitute or pollution control equipment, or the development of new and innovative technologies. Benefits may also include the positive effects on materials, buildings, and recreation, which might otherwise be adversely affected by exposure to the chemical. Risk management is a kind of balancing act. Critics of the process sometimes fear the scale may tip too heavily on the side of economic considerations and not enough toward human health, or vice versa. Certainly, the influence of economics cannot be denied. That's even a factor in our personal risk decisions. The acceptability of a personal risk often depends on how it affects the pocketbook. Risk management is a process of choosing the best alternative for minimizing risk from specific harmful substances or practices. Risk management, using risk assessment as a tool, is a rational process for evaluating our regulatory choices. It is also a process which is continuously being improved and refined as we learn more and more about hazardous substances and their effects on our health and environment. Keep in mind, our concerns about these effects have come about relatively recently. Our environmental conscience emerged during the 1960s, and the repercussions of past and present sins are still manifesting. But we are making progress, and progress, after all, is a positive word. We can maintain our current style of living, but we must also make a commitment to finding better ways of producing goods and disposing of waste. That's progress. Maintaining and improving environmental quality and public health is progress. Ultimately, our goal is not to see how many more harmful chemicals we can tolerate, but to strive to reduce, avoid, eliminate, or very effectively mitigate the presence of toxics in our environment. Life, in the best of all possible worlds, will most certainly require some hard choices from all of us.